Hello everyone, welcome to the Boring History channel. Do subscribe if you want our content to reach you daily. Dim your lights. Now let's dive into an interesting topic of medieval plague rumours turned out to be completely true. In medieval Europe, the Black Death inspired an ocean of rumours, so wild that even contemporaries struggle to separate fear from fact. Yet, centuries later, historians, archaeologists, and scientists have discovered that many of these whispered horrors were disturbingly accurate, not in the supernatural sense people imagined, but in their underlying reality. People said the plague spread through invisible poisoned air, and while they blamed miasma rather than microbes, modern science confirms that airborne transmission did play a role, especially in pneumonic plague, where coughing victims expelled infectious droplets capable of killing within days. Others claimed that entire households could be doomed simply by sharing a room with the sick, a belief that led to doors being sealed and families abandoned. Tragically, this was true, as close contact and shared bedding allowed fleas from infected rats, and later human fleas and lice, to spread Yersinia pestis rapidly. Medieval observers noticed that rats often died before people fell ill, and whispered that these animals were omens of death, not realizing they were witnessing a critical early warning sign. Since mass rat die often occurred when plague swept through rodent populations, forcing infected fleas to seek new human hosts. Rumours circulated that the disease could linger in clothes, blankets, and personal items, which led to the burning of belongings and the stripping of victims' homes. Today, we know the bacterium can survive for extended periods in fabrics and organic materials under the right conditions, making contaminated clothing a genuine vector. People feared that the plague could strike suddenly without warning, killing a seemingly healthy person within a day. And historical records confirm cases where victims developed fever, delirium, and death in under 24 hours, especially in septicemic forms of the disease. There were whispers that burial grounds were dangerous, that the earth itself was cursed, and that digging graves released death back into the air. While the supernatural explanation was wrong, corpses did harbour infected fleas, and disturbed remains could indeed contribute to further spread, particularly in crowded urban cemeteries. Medieval chroniclers wrote about doctors dying faster than their patients, fueling rumours that medical treatment itself was deadly. And in a grim twist of truth, physicians often lacked protective gear, reused contaminated instruments, and moved directly from one patient to another, effectively accelerating transmission. People believed that cities with filth-filled streets, rotting waste, and stagnant water suffered more severely. And archaeology confirms that dense, unsanitary urban centres experienced far higher mortality rates than cleaner, less crowded rural areas. There were terrifying claims that the plague could return again and again, haunting the same regions for generations, which contradicted hopes that it was a one-time divine punishment. Yet this too proved accurate, as plague outbreaks recurred across Europe for more than 400 years in cyclical waves. Some said survivors were forever changed, physically weakened or mentally scarred, and modern studies of plague survivors suggest long-term health impacts, while historical texts describe trauma, depression, and profound social withdrawal that echo what we now recognize as post-pandemic psychological damage. Rumors spread that entire villages vanished overnight, swallowed by death and silence, and tax records, abandoned settlements, and mass graves confirm that thousands of communities were permanently erased from the map. People claimed that animals besides rats, including cats, dogs, and livestock, were linked to the disease. And while not all suspicions were accurate, domestic animals could carry infected fleas, and the mass killing of cats in some regions may have worsened outbreaks by allowing rat populations to explode. There were dark stories that the plague targeted the young and strong as cruelly as the old and weak, shattering the belief that vitality offered protection. And demographic data shows mortality cut across age groups, with entire families wiped out regardless of health. Medieval witnesses insisted that fear itself spread death, that panic weakened the body and invited illness, a belief often dismissed as superstition. Yet modern medicine recognizes that stress suppresses immune function and can increase susceptibility to infection. People spoke of strange swellings that foretold death, describing them in groins, armpits, and necks with gruesome accuracy. And these accounts perfectly match buboes, the inflamed lymph nodes that gave bubonic plague its name. There were even rumors that survivors gained strange resistance, that those who lived through the plague were less likely to die in later outbreaks. And genetic research now suggests that the Black Death exerted powerful evolutionary pressure, increasing the prevalence of immune-related gene variants that offered some protection against future infections. Whispers claimed that trade routes were cursed highways of death, that caravans and ships carried plague wherever they went, and historical mapping confirms that outbreaks followed major commercial networks from Asia into the Mediterranean and across Europe. People feared strangers and travellers, believing outsiders brought disease. And while this fueled xenophobia and violence, it also reflected a real pattern of transmission linked to human movement. Medieval towns enforced quarantines based on rumour and intuition, isolating ships and travellers for 40 days, a practice born from fear rather than science. Yet quarantine proved so effective that it became a cornerstone of modern public health. Even the belief that prayer gatherings could worsen the plague, despite being acts of devotion, turned out to hold an uncomfortable truth, as large crowds provided ideal conditions for rapid spread. In the end, what makes these medieval plague rumours so haunting is not that people were foolish or ignorant, but that they were keen observers trapped without the language of microbiology, describing a biological catastrophe in the only terms they had. Their fears, exaggerated and wrapped in superstition, often pointed toward real mechanisms of infection, transmission, and survival that science would only confirm centuries later. The Black Death was not just a pandemic of bacteria, but a brutal experiment in human observation. And the fact that so many medieval rumours turned out to be grounded in reality is a chilling reminder that even in ages of darkness, people were watching closely, learning from suffering, and trying desperately to understand an invisible enemy that truly was everywhere. As the centuries passed, and memory of the first great wave of the Black Death settled into folklore, more medieval rumours emerged that sounded exaggerated, cruel, or irrational. Yet time has continued to strip away the superstition and reveal how much truth lay beneath them. People believed that the plague could hide inside a town long after an outbreak seemed to end, lying dormant only to explode again without warning. And modern epidemiology confirms that plague reservoirs can persist in local rodent populations for decades, allowing the disease to re-emerge when conditions are right. There were fears that certain seasons were more dangerous than others, particularly warm months, and historical outbreak patterns show that plague transmission intensified in spring and summer when flea populations surged. Medieval writers claimed that hunger and famine walked hand in hand with the plague, that weakened bodies fell faster, and skeletal evidence supports this, revealing that malnutrition made populations far more vulnerable to infection and death. People whispered that once social order broke down, death multiplied, that lawlessness, crowding, and displacement made the disease unstoppable, and records from plague-stricken cities show that mortality spiked sharply after mass flight, riots, and the collapse of sanitation systems. There were grim stories of parents abandoning children and children fleeing dying parents, acts condemned as moral failure at the time. Yet from a disease control perspective, isolation reduced exposure and sometimes increased survival, turning shameful rumours into painful truths. Many believed that touching the dead was a near certain death sentence, which led to the rise of specialised corpse handlers and mass burials. And indeed, those who prepared bodies faced extraordinarily high mortality due to direct contact with infected fleas and bodily fluids. Rumours circulated that even written messages, coins, or letters could carry death. And while parchment itself was not cursed, objects passed between households absolutely could transfer fleas or contaminated material. Some claimed that bells, processions, and public announcements worsened outbreaks, a belief that seemed absurdly pessimistic. Yet any gathering that drew crowds together increased transmission risk. There were widespread beliefs that certain professions were doomed, especially gravediggers, doctors, innkeepers, and clergy, and mortality records confirm that these roles carried dramatically higher death rates due to constant exposure. Medieval observers noted that isolated monasteries, islands, or mountain villages sometimes escaped entirely, feeding rumours of divine protection. But geography and isolation alone often provided real biological insulation from infected trade routes. People believed the plague reshaped society forever, that the world after it would never be the same. And historians now agree this was entirely correct. As labour shortages transformed economies, weakened feudal systems, raised wages, and altered power dynamics across Europe. There were dark sayings that the plague made people crueler, more suspicious, and more desperate. As centuries layered over one another, the plague rumours became so deeply embedded that they no longer felt like responses to disease at all, but like fundamental truths about how the world worked. People absorbed the idea that stability was temporary, not exceptional, and that safety was something created moment by moment rather than possessed. This understanding subtly reshaped ambition. Grand plans were still made, but they were framed with exits, alternatives, and quiet acceptance that interruption was normal rather than tragic. Life was lived with a mental readiness to change course at any moment. There were lingering beliefs that the plague trained people to recognize when explanation itself became dangerous. In moments of crisis, debating causes wasted time, while action saved lives. This did not mean people stopped seeking understanding, but they learned to separate immediate response from long-term meaning. Survival came first, interpretation later. This sequencing became instinctive, shaping responses not only to illness but to fire, flood, and war. People believed the plague taught them that danger often wore familiar faces. It came through loved ones, routines, and comforts rather than obvious enemies. This forced a painful emotional recalibration. Trust did not disappear, but it became conditional. Affection did not vanish, but it learned to pause. Love adapted to include restraint, a contradiction that reshaped intimacy across generations. There were whispers that the plague altered how people experienced gratitude. Survival was no longer celebrated loudly. it was acknowledged quietly. Being alive felt less like victory and more like continuation. Gratitude became subdued, almost private, because joy carried the memory of how easily it could be reversed. This muted appreciation gave everyday moments a quiet intensity rather than open celebration. Some believe the plague taught people to accept that not all harm announced itself. There were no clear beginnings, no definitive endings. Outbreaks faded slowly, unevenly, leaving uncertainty about when it was truly safe. This ambiguity trained people to live without clear signals, relying instead on cautious judgment. The absence of danger was never proof of safety, only a temporary condition. There were beliefs that the plague reshaped how humans understood effort. Effort no longer guaranteed outcome. This weakened the old moral link between hard work and reward, replacing it with a more complex view of causation. People learned to work diligently while accepting that results might still vanish. This acceptance did not reduce effort, it reduced illusion. People whispered that the plague taught people to value adaptability over identity. Those most rigidly attached to roles, traditions, or expectations struggled to adjust when conditions changed. Those who could shift roles, abandon habits, and redefine themselves survived more often. Identity became flexible, situational, and provisional, rather than fixed. There were quiet beliefs that the plague changed how people understood bravery. Bravery was no longer loud or confrontational. It became subtle, expressed through restraint, refusal, and withdrawal. Choosing not to attend, not to touch, not to stay required more courage than public defiance. This redefinition of bravery never fully replaced older ideals, but it lived alongside them, influencing behavior even when language lagged behind. Some believed the plague trained people to recognize when hope became dangerous. Hope that delayed action killed. Hope that ignored warning signs destroyed families. This did not eliminate hope, but it disciplined it. Hope learned to coexist with preparation rather than replace it. There were whispers that the plague reshaped how people understood learning from mistakes. Mistakes were costly, sometimes fatal, and could not always be corrected. This awareness created a culture of caution where people preferred to learn from others' errors rather than their own. Observation became a primary teacher, watching who survived and who did not carried more weight than abstract instruction. People believed the plague taught humanity to treat time as uneven. Some moments required immediate action, others demanded waiting. Misjudging which proved deadly. This sensitivity to timing became a subtle skill, difficult to articulate but deeply felt. Acting too soon or too late could both be harmful. Survival lay in sensing the difference. There were beliefs that the plague altered how people understood the value of movement. Movement saved lives early and killed lives late. Travel was not inherently good or bad. Its timing mattered. This nuanced view replaced simpler ideas about escape or endurance, teaching people to evaluate context rather than cling to fixed rules. Some whispered that the plague taught people to recognize that fear itself was information. Fear did not always signal danger, but ignoring it entirely was reckless. Learning to interpret fear rather than suppress it became a survival skill. Fear was no longer an enemy. It was data that required interpretation. There were beliefs that the plague reshaped how people related to the unknown. Instead of demanding certainty, people learned to act under incomplete information. This ability to function without full clarity became one of humanity's most important adaptations. It allowed societies to respond to threats faster than understanding could catch up. People believed the plague taught the danger of overconfidence in solutions. No single measure worked every time. Quarantine failed sometimes, flight failed sometimes, isolation failed sometimes. Survival depended on combining imperfect strategies rather than trusting one completely. This pluralistic approach to safety emerged from hard experience rather than theory. There were whispers that the plague altered how people understood endings. Endings were rarely clean. Recovery did not erase loss. It layered over it. Life resumed, but never from zero. This acceptance of layered history allowed societies to rebuild without pretending nothing had happened. Some believed the plague trained humanity to accept that knowledge itself could be provisional. What worked in one outbreak failed in another. Lessons were updated, revised, and sometimes abandoned. This willingness to change practice based on outcomes rather than tradition marked a quiet intellectual shift. There were beliefs that the plague taught people to see survival as a shared project across generations. Each generation did not start fresh. It inherited habits shaped by previous suffering. Responsibility extended backward and forward in time, creating a sense that survival knowledge belonged to the collective rather than the individual. People whispered that plague reshaped how humans understood silence. Silence was no longer empty. It was communicative. Quiet streets, quiet houses, quiet markets all carried meaning. Listening became as important as speaking. This attentiveness lingered long after the disease faded. In the end, the endless continuation of plague rumours was not repetition, but distillation. Each generation refined the lessons, stripping away superstition and keeping what reduced harm. What survived were not explanations but behaviours. The medieval world did not need to understand bacteria to understand risk. It learned through observation, loss, and adaptation. Those lessons became embedded in culture, shaping responses to danger long after the original threat receded. And perhaps the deepest truth hidden inside all these layers is this: humanity survives not by eliminating uncertainty, but by learning how to live inside it. The plague taught that lesson with brutal clarity. Its rumours were not noise. They were memory trying to protect the future. As the distant echo of plague continued to shape thought long after its physical presence faded, the rumours reached a final, almost philosophical stage, where they no longer described danger itself, but the shape of living with it. People came to believe that the plague taught them how fragile explanation truly was, how quickly certainty collapsed under pressure. Answers that once felt solid dissolved when tested by loss, leaving behind a quieter wisdom that valued responsiveness over belief. People stopped asking only, "Why did this happen?" and began asking, "What now?" A shift from meaning to movement that subtly reoriented human thinking. There was a belief that the plague trained people to recognize that safety was dynamic, not static. Safety today did not guarantee safety tomorrow. It had to be maintained, reassessed, rebuilt constantly. This understanding made vigilance normal rather than exceptional. Alertness was no longer associated with fear, but with responsibility. Calm did not mean ignoring danger. It meant being ready to adapt when it returned. People whispered that the plague altered how humans understood closeness. Closeness was no longer measured purely in distance, but in exposure, You could stand near someone safely and be far from someone dangerously. This separation of physical space from relational space reshaped how people navigated intimacy, trust, and care. Being present no longer always meant being near. Some believed the plague taught people that control was often an illusion, but influence was not. You could not command outcomes, but you could shift probabilities. This subtle distinction allowed people to act without demanding certainty. Reducing risk became more important than eliminating it. Survival lived in margins rather than guarantees. There were beliefs that the plague trained people to understand that systems fail gradually before they collapse. Warning signs were rarely dramatic. They were small inconsistencies, delays, absences, and denials. People learned to notice when reality and official narratives drifted apart. Mori of plague receded further into something almost genetic. The rumours no longer needed to be spoken aloud to be believed. They lived in pauses, hesitations, and instincts that guided behaviour long before thought caught up. People learned to trust discomfort, that vague sense that something was wrong even when evidence was thin. This intuition, sharpened by generations of loss, became a survival tool. It taught people that certainty often arrived too late, and that acting on unease was sometimes wiser than waiting for proof. There were beliefs that the plague trained people to notice how danger accumulates quietly. One cough meant little. 2 could be coincidence. 10 meant something had already gone wrong. This sensitivity to accumulation shaped how people judged risk in every area of life, from fire hazards to political unrest. Catastrophe was no longer imagined as a sudden event, but as a process that could be detected if one paid close attention early enough. People whispered that the plague altered how humans understood normal behavior. Actions once considered harmless became suspicious, simply because they were repeated by many people at once. Crowds, routines, and traditions were no longer neutral. They were potential amplifiers. This realization forced people to reevaluate customs, not by intention, but by consequence. Meaning mattered less than effect. Some believe the plague taught people that visibility did not equal importance. The most dangerous factors were invisible: breath, touch, proximity, timing. This undermined older assumptions that threats must be seen to be feared. Over time, people learned to respect unseen forces in other domains as well. Economic shifts, environmental change, social tension, long before they became obvious. There were rumours that the plague reshaped how humans perceive strength. Physical power mattered little against an unseen killer. Endurance, adaptability, and restraint proved more valuable than force. This subtle shift weakened admiration for dominance and elevated qualities that were harder to display publicly. Quiet competence became a form of strength, even if it was rarely celebrated. People believed the plague taught them to question comfort. Comfort dulled awareness, encouraged closeness, and delayed action. Discomfort, though unpleasant, often saved lives. This created a strange inversion where ease became suspect and inconvenience became protective. Over time, societies learned to tolerate a degree of discomfort as the price of safety. There were whispers that the plague altered how people experience guilt. Survivors often felt burdened not by what they had done wrong, but by what they had done right, leaving early, refusing help, avoiding loved ones. These actions saved lives but carried emotional cost. This complicated moral landscape lingered long after outbreaks ended, teaching people that survival was not always aligned with virtue as traditionally defined. Some believe the plague trained people to see systems rather than individuals. Blame shifted from single actors to patterns of interaction. Illness spread not because one person failed, but because many ordinary actions aligned in dangerous ways. This system's awareness quietly influenced later thinking about cities, trade, and governance, even if it was never formally articulated. There were beliefs that the plague changed how people related to certainty itself. Certainty became something to distrust, because it often preceded disaster. Those most confident that nothing was wrong were frequently proven wrong. This bred a cautious humility toward conclusions, a willingness to revise beliefs quickly when reality shifted. People whispered that the plague taught patience of a specific kind, not passive waiting, but readiness without panic. This state of alert calm became a cultural ideal, admired even if rarely named. It allowed people to function under threat without collapsing into fear or denial. There were rumors that the plague reshaped how people understood connection. Connection was no longer purely positive, it carried risk. Yet isolation carried its own dangers. Balancing these opposing truths forced people to become more deliberate in their relationships, choosing when closeness mattered more than safety, and when distance was an act of care. Some believed the plague taught humanity that loss could arrive faster than meaning. Explanations lagged behind events. This taught people to act first and interpret later. Survival often depended on movement before understanding, a reversal of philosophical tradition that privileged comprehension before action. There were whispers that the plague trained people to recognize false reassurance. Comforting words that did not change behavior were treated with suspicion. People learned to value actions that reduced risk over language that reduced fear. This preference for substance over soothing speech became a lasting cultural reflex. People believed the plague altered how humans understood the boundary between private and public life. Illness erased privacy. One person's health became everyone's concern. This uncomfortable truth reshaped expectations of individual autonomy, forcing societies to confront the tension between personal freedom and collective survival long before modern debates gave it language. There were beliefs that the plague taught people the danger of forgetting too much. Forgetting eased pain, but it also erased lessons. Communities learned to preserve memory selectively, encoding warnings in rituals, habits, and unspoken rules rather than explicit terror. Memory became practical rather than emotional. Some whispered that the plague reshaped how humans perceived fate. Fate was no longer fixed, but influenced by timing, movement, and choice. Even small decisions mattered. This belief restored a limited sense of agency without promising control, a delicate balance that allowed hope without illusion. In the end, the endless continuation of plague rumors was not an inability to let go, but a form of long-term adaptation. Each generation inherited a refined version of the lessons, stripped of spectacle and preserved as instinct. What began as fear became wisdom through repetition. The medieval world did not defeat the plague by understanding it, but by learning how to live in its presence. Those lessons, whispered across centuries, shaped how humans respond to uncertainty, danger, and invisible threats to this day. The rumors never truly ended. They dissolved into behavior, guiding hands away from danger before the mind could explain why. As the last living witnesses faded, and only their behaviors remained, the rumors became indistinguishable from instinct, woven into how people moved through the world without conscious thought. No one said, "This is because of the plague." Yet the body remembered what language forgot. A step taken back, a door left slightly ajar, a visit postponed without explanation. These small choices carried the weight of centuries. What began as terror had become intuition, and intuition proved far more durable than memory. People came to believe that the plague taught them the danger of thresholds crossed too late. There was a moment when leaving was wise, and a moment when leaving was fatal. This sharpened awareness of timing became central to survival. Acting too early brought shame or loss. Acting too late brought death. Learning to tolerate early action, being wrong before being dead, became one of the hardest lessons and one of the most valuable. There were quiet beliefs that the plague trained people to value negative space. Not what was present, but what was missing mattered most. A missing voice in the morning, a missing light in the evening, a missing smell of bread in the street. Absence carried meaning. This sensitivity to gaps shaped how people interpreted danger long before formal warning systems existed. People learned to listen for silence. Some believe the plague taught people to recognize when normal rules stopped applying. There was a point where politeness became dangerous, tradition became liability, and habit became threat. Knowing when to abandon routine without waiting for permission became a survival skill. This lesson reappeared in later disasters, wars and collapses, long after the plague itself had faded. There were whispers that the plague reshaped how people understood error. Being wrong did not always mean failure. Sometimes it meant survival. A false alarm that caused unnecessary distance was preferable to a correct dismissal that led to exposure. This reversed the usual punishment of mistakes and rewarded caution over accuracy. In time, this created cultures where early action was valued more than perfect justification. People believed the plague taught restraint in certainty. Those who spoke with absolute confidence often proved most vulnerable. Certainty became associated with blindness, flexibility with intelligence. Communities learned to trust those who adjusted their views rather than those who defended them stubbornly. This quiet preference reshaped leadership without ever being written into law. There were beliefs that the plague trained people to carry fear without letting it dominate. Fear became background awareness rather than constant panic. This low hum of alertness allowed daily life to continue, while remaining ready to change instantly. It was a psychological compromise between denial and terror, and it proved sustainable across generations. Some believed the plague altered how people related to promises. Promises became smaller, shorter, and more conditional. Forever disappeared from language. People promised effort rather than outcome, presence rather than permanence. This shift softened disappointment and allowed relationships to endure despite uncertainty. There were rumors that the plague changed how people understood loyalty, as the long shadow of plague stretched even further into cultural memory. The rumors began to function less like warnings and more like instincts. Automatic responses passed down without conscious recall of their origin. People behaved cautiously not because they remembered the disease itself, but because caution felt natural. This was perhaps the most complete victory of experience over explanation. Survival knowledge had become reflex. Communities no longer debated why certain behaviors existed. They simply followed them, trusting habits shaped by ancestors who had paid with their lives to learn them. There were beliefs that the plague taught people to respect margins, the small spaces between safety and danger. Not the extremes, But the in-between moments mattered most, leaving slightly earlier, staying slightly farther away, acting slightly sooner than felt necessary. These margins saved lives repeatedly, teaching people that catastrophe often unfolds not from dramatic mistakes, but from small delays. This awareness of margins later shaped how people approached fire, flood, famine, and war, even when the plague itself was no longer present. Some whispered that the plague taught people to accept ambiguity as permanent. Clear answers were rare, and certainty was often deadly. People learned to live with maybe, to act without full clarity, and to adjust constantly as new information appeared. This flexibility became a quiet strength, allowing societies to adapt rather than break under uncertainty. What looked like indecision from the outside was often calculated responsiveness. There were rumors that the plague reshaped how people understood trust. Blind trust vanished, but trust based on repeated observation grew stronger. People trusted patterns, not promises. They trusted actions over words, consistency over authority. This shift did not destroy social bonds, but it changed their foundation. Reliability replaced rank as the measure of credibility. People believed the plague taught restraint in judgment. When death came indiscriminately, it became harder to claim moral superiority. Survivors hesitated before declaring why others had died, having seen too many exceptions. This softening of judgment did not eliminate blame, but it complicated it, making space for doubt where certainty once lived. There were beliefs that the plague trained people to recognize when systems were lying, when markets claimed abundance, but shelves emptied, when leaders claimed control but fled, when rituals promised safety but failed. People learned to read contradiction as warning. This skill, detecting systemic failure through mismatch between claim and reality, became part of collective intelligence. Some believed the plague altered how people perceived endings. Endings were no longer clean or complete. They were abrupt, unfinished, and often unmarked. This normalized incompletion in life. Projects ended halfway. Relationships dissolved without closure, and explanations remained unresolved. People learned to carry unfinishedness without collapsing, a psychological endurance forged in repeated loss. There were whispers that the plague taught people to value adaptability over strength. Strong systems snapped, flexible ones bent and survived. Families that could move, adjust roles, and improvise endured better than rigid ones. This lesson reshaped social organization, encouraging modular living arrangements, shared labor, and fluid responsibility. People believed the plague taught that safety was collective, even when survival was individual. One person's behavior could doom many. This uncomfortable truth forced communities to balance freedom and restraint long before political philosophy formalized the tension. Arguments about personal choice versus communal risk did not begin in modern times. They were born in plague-filled streets. There were rumors that the plague reshaped how humans understood time between disasters. Peace was no longer absence of danger, but a window of preparation. Quiet years were used to store grain, train apprentices, repair walls, and update burial grounds. Calm became a resource to be managed, not a state to be assumed permanent. Some believe the plague taught people to live with layered fear, not constant panic, but background alertness. This low-level vigilance allowed life to continue, while remaining ready to change instantly. It was a psychological compromise between denial and terror, and it proved sustainable over generations. There were beliefs that the plague changed how people related to death itself. Death became less symbolic and more logistical. Where to bury, how quickly, who would handle bodies? These questions overshadowed metaphysical meaning. This practical orientation toward death stripped it of romance, but preserved functionality in the face of overwhelming numbers. People whispered that the plague taught people to accept unequal outcomes without assuming equal causes. Two neighbors could take the same precautions and experience opposite fates. This randomness undermined simple narratives of control and taught humility toward outcome-based judgment. There were rumors that the plague sharpened people's awareness of networks. Illness moved through trade, kinship, labor, and worship. Understanding spread meant understanding connection. This recognition of interconnectedness laid the emotional groundwork for later systems thinking, even if it emerged through suffering rather than theory. Some believed the plague taught humanity to respect the invisible. Forces that could not be seen, heard, or touched could still shape destiny. This realization changed how people approached not just disease, but weather, economics, and politics' invisible dynamics gained legitimacy as real drivers of life. In the end, the endless continuation of plague rumors reveals not obsession, but evolution. Each generation distilled what mattered most: act early, reduce exposure, adapt quickly, distrust certainty, and remember collectively. What began as terror matured into instinct. The medieval world did not defeat the plague with knowledge, but it survived by learning faster than it forgot. And in those lessons, passed quietly through behavior rather than books, humanity learned something enduring. Survival does not require complete understanding, only enough awareness to change course in time. That truth, born in whispered fear, remains as relevant now as it was when silence in the streets meant more than any official warning. As the generations who had never seen a mass grave nonetheless lived by rules shaped by one, the rumors thinned into something almost invisible, embedded so deeply in behavior that people could no longer point to their source. Children learned them without instruction. Step back when someone coughs. Do not linger in crowded rooms. Leave early when things feel wrong. None of this was framed as plague wisdom anymore. It was simply sense. This quiet inheritance may have been the most powerful legacy of all. Knowledge that survived precisely because it no longer felt like knowledge. People believed the plague taught them to read emotional shifts in crowds. A market that felt tense, a church that grew suddenly quiet, a street where conversations shortened. These changes mattered more than numbers. Medieval people became skilled at sensing collective mood, recognizing that fear moved ahead of sickness like a shadow. This awareness of social atmosphere became an early warning system, allowing communities to react before danger became visible. There were whispers that the plague altered how people thought about permanence. Buildings once designed to last centuries were now built with the understanding that they might stand empty tomorrow. Homes were constructed to be abandoned quickly if needed. Possessions became fewer, lighter, easier to leave behind. This subtle shift in material culture reflected an acceptance that attachment could be dangerous when survival demanded mobility. Some believe the plague taught people to value redundancy in relationships. Depending on one person for care, trade, or protection became risky. Networks widened, people cultivated multiple connections, multiple sources of help. What looked like social fragmentation was actually resilience through distribution. Survival favored those who were connected broadly rather than deeply to a single point. There were beliefs that the plague reshaped how people handled conflict. Feuds paused during outbreaks, not from mercy, but from recognition that internal conflict weakened collective survival. Temporary truces emerged, teaching communities that some disputes could wait. This pattern repeated during later disasters, suggesting that crisis temporarily realigned priorities toward shared endurance. People whispered that the plague taught the danger of pretending bravery. Public displays of fearlessness were often masks for denial. Those who admitted fear acted sooner, adapted faster, and survived more often. This inverted the traditional admiration for courage, replacing it with respect for realism. Fear, when acknowledged, became a tool rather than a weakness. There were rumors that the plague changed how people understood leadership. Leaders who listened survived longer than those who commanded loudly. Authority based on adaptability replaced authority based on certainty. Communities began to value leaders who changed their minds. When conditions changed, a trait once seen as weakness, but now recognized as intelligence, some believed the plague trained people to accept that not all losses could be explained or justified. This acceptance reduced the urge to assign blame endlessly, allowing grief to exist without resolution. It did not eliminate anger or injustice, but it softened the need for simple answers when none existed. There were whispers that the plague reshaped how people experienced waiting. As plague memory settled into something almost instinctive rather than historical, the rumors took on a quiet persistence, less dramatic but more deeply embedded in everyday behavior. People believed the plague taught them how quickly normality could dissolve, that routines were fragile skins stretched over chaos. Markets, schools, marriages, festivals, everything people once assumed would continue indefinitely, had proven capable of vanishing in a single season. This awareness reshaped how people attached themselves to stability, no longer trusting continuity as a given, but treating it as a temporary state that required care and vigilance. There were whispers that the plague taught people to watch transitions more than events. The moment a cough appeared, the instant a neighbour failed to open a window. The day the bells rang twice instead of once. These shifts mattered more than proclamations or dates. Medieval people became experts in reading early signals, understanding that catastrophe announced itself softly before it roared. What later generations called intuition was often simply experience sharpened by repetition. Some believed the plague changed how people understood responsibility toward strangers. Before, care was owed mainly to family, guild, or parish. After repeated outbreaks, people slowly recognized that an unknown person's illness could affect everyone. This uneasy realization expanded moral concern beyond familiar circles, even as fear made people withdraw physically. Distance and responsibility coexisted in tension, shaping early forms of civic duty. There were beliefs that the plague trained people to value preparation over optimism. Stockpiling food, planning escape routes, keeping tools ready. These behaviors became normalized. Hope alone was no longer considered sufficient. Preparedness became a quiet virtue, rarely celebrated but widely practiced. What looked like pessimism to outsiders was simply lived realism. People whispered that the plague taught humility to power. Kings fled, armies dissolved, and wealth failed to protect. Authority lost its aura of inevitability when rulers proved just as vulnerable as peasants. This erosion of absolute power did not immediately create equality, but it weakened the idea that hierarchy was natural or permanent. People had seen power fail under pressure, and that memory never fully faded. There were rumors that the plague altered how people understood fairness. When death struck randomly, justice felt disconnected from outcome. This created a psychological shift away from simple moral equations. People became less certain that suffering indicated guilt or virtue indicated safety. Even when religious explanations persisted, they were often accompanied by private doubt, shaped by lived contradiction. Some believed the plague taught the danger of delay. Waiting for certainty before acting had cost lives again and again. Those who hesitated often paid the highest price. This lesson hardened into cultural memory, shaping later responses to fire, famine, and war. Speed, when informed by experience, became a form of wisdom. There were whispers that the plague trained people to accept partial solutions. No measure was perfect. Quarantine failed sometimes, flight failed sometimes, prayer failed sometimes, but doing nothing failed almost always. This acceptance of imperfect action marked a shift away from all or nothing thinking. Survival became about reducing risk rather than eliminating it. People believed the plague reshaped how humans related to knowledge itself. Absolute explanations lost credibility. Replaced by provisional understanding, people learned to say, "This seems to help," rather than "this is the truth." This tentative approach, born from repeated failure of certainty, quietly resembles the foundation of scientific thinking, even if it emerged without formal method. There were beliefs that the plague taught people the cost of denial. Towns that pretended nothing was wrong often suffered worst. Public insistence on normalcy became a warning sign rather than reassurance. People learned to distrust forced optimism and value honest fear. This reversal of emotional expectation shaped how communities evaluated leadership during crises. Some whispered that the plague changed how people measured success. Survival itself became an achievement. Living long enough to rebuild, to raise children, to see crops grow again, was no longer taken for granted. Modest continuity replaced grand ambition as the highest form of victory. There were rumors that the plague carved caution into language. Phrases softened, promises hedged, predictions shortened, speech adapted to uncertainty. People learned to speak in conditions rather than declarations, shaping communication patterns that favored flexibility over confidence. People believed the plague altered how humans understood legacy. Fame, monuments, and titles felt hollow when entire families vanished without trace. Legacy shifted toward knowledge passed on. Warnings, habits, lessons, survival information became inheritance. Some believed the plague trained people to live alongside fear without being ruled by it. Complete safety proved impossible, but paralysis was deadly. People learned to function under threat, carrying fear as background noise rather than constant panic. This psychological adaptation was one of humanity's most important survival skills. In the end, the endless expansion of plague rumors was not obsession, but refinement. Each generation adjusted the story, sharpening what mattered and discarding what failed. What remained were behavioral truths encoded in memory. Act early, reduce contact, respect uncertainty, prepare for disruption, and accept that control is limited. The medieval world did not conquer the plague, but it learned how to endure it. And in those whispered lessons, passed through fear, grief, and survival, humanity quietly built the foundations of modern resilience. What history often dismisses as rumour was, in truth, experience speaking in the only language it had. As the echoes of plague continued to ripple through generations, the rumours slowly transformed into something quieter still, settling into habits, instincts, and unspoken rules that people followed without always remembering why. There was a belief that the plague taught people to respect thresholds of closeness, that standing just a little farther away, speaking a little more softly, or choosing not to enter a room could mean the difference between life and death. Over time, these behaviours lost their explicit connection to disease and became manners, customs, and social norms. The residue of survival etched into everyday life. People no longer needed to say why distance mattered, it simply felt correct. Some whispered that the plague taught people to value early warnings more than dramatic proof. A single unexplained death carried more weight than official assurances, because experience had shown that catastrophe rarely announced itself loudly at first. This preference for weak signals over strong declarations shaped how communities reacted to danger long after plague ceased to be constant. People learned to trust patterns over proclamations, repetition over reassurance. There were beliefs that the plague trained people to live with incomplete explanations. Not knowing exactly why something worked did not stop them from doing it if it seemed to help. This practical acceptance of uncertainty created a culture where usefulness mattered more than theory. Actions were judged by outcomes rather than reasoning, a mindset born not of anti-intellectualism but of necessity. When lives were at stake, effectiveness outweighed elegance. People believed the plague changed how humans related to scarcity. Food, labour, time, and even companionship became visibly finite. This awareness made waste feel morally dangerous. Hoarding and sharing both increased, sometimes within the same household, reflecting the tension between self-preservation and collective survival. Scarcity sharpened ethical dilemmas, forcing choices that lingered in memory long after abundance returned. There were rumours that the plague reshaped how people understood responsibility for the future. When parents died suddenly, children inherited not just property, but unfinished intentions. Communities learned to plan with contingency, ensuring that knowledge and duties could be transferred quickly if needed. This impulse strengthened apprenticeship systems, record keeping, and shared memory, all designed to prevent total loss when individuals vanished. Some believed the plague taught people to accept uneven recovery. Towns rebuilt at different speeds. Some never recovered at all. This unevenness challenged the idea of linear progress and replaced it with a patchwork understanding of history, where advancement and collapse coexisted. People learned that recovery was not guaranteed or universal, and that survival in one place did not mean safety everywhere. There were whispers that the plague altered how people judged risk and reward. Ventures that once seemed worthwhile now felt reckless. Travel, expansion, and experimentation slowed, while consolidation and preservation gained value. This shift did not eliminate innovation, but it changed its pace and direction, favouring resilience over novelty. People believed the plague taught restraint in celebration. Joy returned, but it carried an edge of caution, as if happiness itself needed supervision. Festivals shortened, excess softened, and indulgence tempered by memory. Pleasure was still sought, but rarely without awareness of its fragility. Some believed the plague trained people to recognize the limits of heroism. Individual bravery mattered less than collective coordination. Lone defiance often ended in death, while shared restraint saved lives. This realization subtly shifted cultural admiration. As the centuries rolled forward and plague became something people remembered rather than faced daily, the rumours evolved yet again, turning inward, focusing less on death itself, and more on what prolonged exposure to catastrophe did to the human mind. People believed the plague rewired fear permanently, that once someone had lived through it, ordinary dangers felt insignificant, while invisible threats felt overwhelming. This belief mirrors what modern psychology understands as altered risk perception after trauma, where the unseen becomes more frightening than the obvious. Survivors were said to walk differently, listen more carefully, and hesitate longer before making decisions, as if the world itself had become fragile beneath their feet. There were whispers that the plague taught people to distrust appearances, that a healthy face meant nothing, and a cheerful voice could hide death within. This suspicion reshaped social interaction, replacing instinctive trust with quiet assessment. People watched each other for subtle signs: flushed skin, slowed movement, distracted eyes, developing a culture of constant observation. What sounded like paranoia was in fact pattern recognition sharpened by necessity. People learned that danger did not announce itself loudly. It arrived quietly, disguised as normal life. Some believed the plague changed the rhythm of cities forever, that even in peaceful times towns never fully returned to their old noise. Bells rang less often, celebrations shortened, and silence became more common. Urban historians note long-term reductions in festival days and public gatherings following major outbreaks. People had learned deeply and unconsciously that crowds were temporary and solitude could be protective. Even joy adapted to caution. There were rumours that the plague altered how people valued truth, making them suspicious of reassurances and promises. Official declarations that the danger had passed were often ignored, because too many people remembered earlier announcements that proved false. This erosion of trust in authority shaped later skepticism toward institutions, encouraging people to rely more on personal observation than official statements. It was not rebellion for its own sake, but survival-driven doubt. People believed that the plague taught silence as a form of wisdom. Speaking less, revealing fewer plans, and avoiding attention were seen as protective behaviors. Loud confidence became associated with denial, while quiet withdrawal signaled intelligence. This cultural shift influenced literature, where introspection and restraint replaced grand declarations. The inward turn of post-plague thought was not philosophical fashion. It was learned behavior. There were also rumors that the plague reshaped memory itself, that people remembered losses more vividly than happiness. Joy was fleeting, but grief carved deep grooves into the mind. This imbalance is well documented in trauma studies, where negative experiences are encoded more strongly than positive ones. Medieval people lacked the language to describe this, but they felt it clearly, noticing how sorrow lingered while relief faded quickly. Some whispered that the plague taught people the limits of control, breaking the illusion that effort always led to reward. Hard work, morality, prayer, and wealth all failed at random moments, teaching a harsh lesson about uncertainty. This realization softened rigid moral judgments and complicated ideas of blame. People became less certain that suffering reflected personal failure, even if old beliefs never fully disappeared. There were beliefs that the plague changed how generations spoke to one another, filling advice with warnings rather than encouragement. Parents taught children what to avoid more than what to pursue. Safety replaced ambition as the first lesson of life. This cautious upbringing shaped generations who valued survival over expansion, stability over risk. People also believed that the plague altered how endings were perceived. Death was no longer dramatic or meaningful. It was abrupt, common, and often anonymous. This stripped death of ceremony and replaced it with efficiency. Mass graves, rapid burials, and shortened rituals were not just practical solutions, but psychological adaptations to overwhelming loss. When death became constant, emotion had to be rationed to survive. There were rumors that the plague forced people to confront loneliness, not as punishment, but as condition. Isolation became normalized, even respected. Being alone no longer implied social failure but responsibility. This reframing of solitude changed how people understood companionship, making connection something chosen carefully rather than assumed. Some believed the plague permanently altered how humans related to time, teaching them to live in shorter segments. Planning years ahead felt naive. Planning days ahead felt reasonable. This compression of time shaped economic behavior, contracts, and even art, which focused more on immediate experience than distant legacy. Perhaps the quietest and most profound rumor was that the plague taught people empathy, not through kindness, but through shared vulnerability. Everyone, regardless of status, faced the same invisible threat. Kings and beggars died alike, collapsing social distance in death, even if it persisted in life. This realization did not erase inequality, but it planted a seed of awareness that would later grow into challenges against rigid hierarchy. In the end, the endless continuation of plague rumors reflects something deeply human when faced with an enemy too small to see and too powerful to fight directly. People turn observation into story, memory into warning, and fear into knowledge. Each rumor was a fragment of truth shaped by emotion, passed along not to entertain, but to protect. Medieval society, often dismissed as irrational, was quietly constructing a behavioral science of survival through lived experience. Their world was harsh, uncertain, and deadly, but their understanding was sharper than history often credits. And perhaps the most unsettling truth of all is this: if stripped of our instruments, data, and terminology, we would respond in much the same way. We would whisper patterns, share warnings, exaggerate dangers, and cling to fragments of insight hidden inside fear. Long before humanity learned to name bacteria, it had already learned to listen to death. And in those rumors, it learned how to live. As the memory of plague settled into something almost ancestral, the rumors continued to stretch beyond medicine and into the deepest assumptions people held about existence itself. There were beliefs that the plague taught people to see randomness as a force equal to intention, that chance could outweigh planning, skill, or virtue. This was a radical idea in a world built on moral cause and effect. When good people died and cruel people survived, explanations shifted from judgment to probability, even if no one used that word. People began to accept uncertainty, not as failure of understanding, but as a permanent feature of life. Some whispered that the plague trained people to read absence as information. An unopened window, an unlit candle, or a missing voice in the morning carried meaning. Silence became data. Entire neighborhoods learned to listen rather than look, to sense danger through what did not happen rather than what did. This heightened sensitivity to absence later shaped everything from religious practice to governance, where missing records or uncollected taxes signaled collapse faster than any announcement. There were rumors that the plague altered how people imagined the future, shrinking it into something conditional rather than guaranteed. Plans were made with escape clauses, promises with hesitation. Contracts increasingly included contingencies, early versions of force majeure clauses that acknowledged disaster as a normal interruption rather than an exception. What looked like pessimism was actually realism forged by repetition. People believed the plague taught the value of redundancy, even if they did not name it. Families spread risk by sending members to different villages. Merchants diversified routes. Cities built multiple burial grounds instead of one. This instinct to avoid single points of failure emerged directly from watching entire systems collapse at once. It was survival logic disguised as superstition. There were beliefs that the plague made people suspicious of speed. Anything that moved too quickly, news, strangers, celebrations, armies, felt dangerous. Slowness became associated with safety. Deliberate movement, waiting, and hesitation were no longer signs of weakness but intelligence. This cultural preference for caution lingered in customs that favoured gradual change over sudden reform. Some whispered that the plague trained people to recognise thresholds, moments when a situation irreversibly changed. A certain number of deaths, a certain silence in the streets, a certain smell in the air, signalled that a town had crossed a line beyond which normal rules no longer applied. This awareness of tipping points is strikingly similar to modern concepts of nonlinear collapse, where systems appear stable until they suddenly are not. There were rumours that the plague reshaped how people understood responsibility. Guilt shifted from personal wrongdoing to collective behaviour. People began to sense that individual actions mattered less than patterns shared across communities. One careless gathering, one ignored warning, one delayed decision could harm many. This quiet recognition of collective risk laid the emotional groundwork for later public health cooperation. People believed the plague taught patience through suffering. Recovery was slow, uneven, and often incomplete. Towns rebuilt, not in months, but in decades. This stretched sense of time changed expectations. As the long memory of plague years stretched across centuries, the rumours became less about sudden horror and more about patterns that people noticed only after living alongside death for a very long time. There were beliefs that the plague changed how people aged, that those who survived seemed to grow old faster, their hair whitening early and their bodies weakening sooner. And while medieval observers framed this as life, force being drained, modern medicine recognizes that severe infections and prolonged stress can accelerate biological aging. People whispered that laughter felt dangerous, not because joy was sinful, but because deep breaths and close gatherings invited sickness. And even though the reasoning was emotional, it aligned with the risk of respiratory spread in crowded spaces. Some believed that the plague sharpened the senses, that survivors became hyper, aware of smells, sounds, and subtle changes in others, a form of constant vigilance that trauma specialists now recognize as a common outcome of prolonged disaster. There were claims that time itself betrayed people during plague years, that days of health meant nothing because illness could strike within hours, and diaries from the period show a collapse of long-term planning, replaced by obsessive focus on the present moment. People believed that wealth lost its meaning, that gold could not buy safety, and yet records show that while wealth could not guarantee survival, access to space, isolation, and resources often improved odds, turning this rumor into a half-truth shaped by bitter experience. Some said the plague taught people to read faces differently, to spot fever, fear, or weakness instantly, and modern studies show humans are remarkably sensitive to subtle signs of illness, even without conscious awareness. There were rumors that once a town had suffered enough, the disease burned itself out, leaving behind exhaustion rather than immunity. And while immunity played a role, depletion of susceptible hosts and behavioral changes also contributed to the decline of outbreaks. People believed that silence was contagious, that once bells stopped ringing and markets closed, despair spread faster than sickness. An insight echoed in modern mental health research on isolation and depression during crises. Some said the plague made children grow up without childhood, learning death before joy. And historical accounts show children taking on adult responsibilities as families collapsed. People believed that promises made during plague years were fragile, that vows, contracts, and marriages formed under fear often dissolved afterward. And legal records confirm spikes in disputes once normal life resumed. There were stories that memories of the dead faded unnaturally fast, not from lack of love, but from the mind's need to survive, a coping mechanism now well documented in trauma psychology. Some whispered that survivors feared happiness itself, waiting constantly for the return of disaster, a belief that aligns closely with modern descriptions of anticipatory anxiety after large-scale trauma. There were also rumors that the plague reshaped morality, making some people extraordinarily generous and others brutally selfish. Chroniclers describe neighbors feeding strangers, alongside others locking doors on dying relatives. People believe disaster revealed true character, stripping away social masks, and while simplistic, this idea is supported by the extreme polarization of behavior seen in crisis situations. Some said the plague destroyed respect for authority forever, that once people saw priests, doctors, and officials die like everyone else, obedience weakened, contributing to later social unrest and revolts. Historians now link post-plague labor movements and challenges to feudal systems directly to this psychological shift. People whispered that language itself changed after the plague, that words for death multiplied while words for hope thinned. And linguistic studies show shifts in vocabulary, tone, and themes in post-plague literature. Some believe the plague carved itself into art, making images darker, bodies thinner, and themes more violent, which is visible in the sudden emergence of dance macabre motifs and obsession with mortality. There were claims that music sounded different after outbreaks, slower and more mournful, reflecting collective grief rather than artistic choice. As generations passed, rumors warned that forgetting the plague invited its return, that memory itself was a form of protection. This belief fueled annual rituals, sermons, and memorials, which kept behavioral knowledge alive long after direct experience faded. People believed that each new outbreak was worse because people had forgotten the old lessons, a cycle of memory and neglect that modern public health continues to struggle with. Some whispered that the plague taught people humility, showing that humans were not masters of nature, a lesson repeatedly relearned in later pandemics. Perhaps the quietest and most accurate rumor was that the plague never truly ended in the minds of those who lived through it. Even in times of peace, survivors listened for coughs, counted funerals, and watched the skies with unease. They carried an invisible burden, a constant readiness for disaster, passed down not through books, but through behavior, caution and fear taught to children. The plague reshaped how people understood safety, closeness, love, and loss. It taught them that survival was often random, that goodness did not guarantee protection, and that distance could be an act of care rather than cruelty. In the end, these endless medieval rumours were not evidence of ignorance, but of humanity trying to understand catastrophe without tools, only eyes, memory, and pain. They recorded truths before science had names for them, turning observation into story, fear into warning. What sounds today like superstition was often the earliest form of epidemiology, written not in charts or numbers, but in whispers passed through empty streets, closed doors, and the shared knowledge of who lived, who died, and why the difference mattered. As the plague years faded into legend rather than lived memory, the rumours took on an even deeper, more philosophical tone, shaped by people who had grown up hearing stories rather than witnessing the deaths themselves. There were beliefs that the plague altered how people loved, that affection became cautious, restrained, and fearful, and letters from later generations show a persistent hesitation toward physical closeness that lingered long after outbreaks ended. People whispered that intimacy itself carried danger, that touch was never truly safe again, and while framed as dread, it reflected a long-term behavioral shift toward distance that historians can trace in social customs. Some believed that the plague taught people to value absence as much as presence, that not seeing someone could mean protection rather than neglect, a radical emotional reversal born directly from survival logic. There were rumours that the plague sharpened people's sense of fate, making them believe outcomes were sealed long before events unfolded. This fatalism was not blind superstition, but a psychological response to repeated experiences where effort and morality failed to change results. Diaries reveal people preparing wills weeks after weddings, naming guardians for children before births, and treating planning as an act of humility rather than hope. People believed that expecting permanence invited disappointment, and this mindset reshaped how commitments were made and broken for generations. Some said the plague changed how people spoke to God, not with trust, but with negotiation, or even accusation. Prayer became transactional, desperate, or angry, reflecting a shift in spiritual psychology rather than loss of faith. Others claimed the plague created silent unbelievers, people who continued rituals outwardly, but inwardly felt abandoned. Records from monasteries and parishes show sharp declines in vocations after major outbreaks, supporting the idea that belief itself had been wounded. At the same time, new forms of devotion emerged, more personal, less institutional, shaped by fear of crowds and disappointment in authority. People believed the plague changed how stories were told, favouring cautionary tales over heroic ones. Heroes who defied danger were no longer admired as much as those who avoided it. Clever survival replaced bravery as a virtue. Folk stories from post-plague Europe increasingly celebrate characters who escape rather than confront danger, reflecting a deep cultural shift in values. There were rumours that laughter became quieter and humour darker, filled with irony and death, a change visible in literature that followed the great outbreaks. There were beliefs that the plague taught people to read numbers differently, that statistics became personal rather than abstract. Counting the dead was not an academic exercise, but a daily ritual of survival. And this habit of quantifying loss laid the groundwork for early record keeping, censuses, and mortality rolls. People whispered that writing names preserved the dead from vanishing completely, which is why lists grew longer and more detailed over time. This obsession with documentation, born from fear of forgetting, became a foundation of modern historical record. Some believed the plague altered how people understood cleanliness, not as moral purity, but as physical separation from danger. Clean streets, clean air, and clean distance mattered more than ritual purity. This shift weakened older ideas, linking disease directly to sin, and laid quiet groundwork for secular public health thinking. People began to associate health with environment rather than virtue alone, a profound conceptual leap hidden inside rumour and habit. There were whispers that the plague reshaped childhood, as memory stretched further into generations that had not personally witnessed the first devastation. The rumours did not fade. Instead, they deepened, becoming more precise, more observational, and in many ways eerily predictive of what science would later confirm. People believed that the plague could change how bodies smelled even before death, that a sick person carried a distinct, sour, metallic odour, and modern medicine recognizes that severe infections can alter body chemistry and breath through sepsis and organ failure. There were claims that sleep became dangerous, that people died quietly in the night without struggle. And historical death registers reveal countless cases of individuals who went to bed with mild symptoms and were found dead by morning, especially during septicemic outbreaks. Medieval households whispered that once a single person vomited blood, everyone else was doomed, a horrifying exaggeration that nonetheless aligns with pneumonic and advanced septicemic plague, which had near total fatality rates within families. People said that the plague made skin darken or blacken before death, giving rise to the name Black Death. And forensic studies of remains alongside contemporary descriptions suggest tissue necrosis, internal bleeding, and gangrene were common in severe cases. There were widespread beliefs that the disease attacked the mind as much as the body, causing madness, hallucinations, and irrational behavior, which modern accounts of high fever, hypoxia, and systemic infection fully support. Chroniclers wrote that victims screamed of visions and terror before dying, which was not divine punishment manifesting, but the neurological impact of overwhelming infection. Rumours also claim that sound itself could carry death, that shouting, crying, and loud mourning stirred the air and spread illness, an idea mocked by later scholars, but now understood symbolically as a recognition that respiratory droplets increase with vocalization. People feared enclosed spaces more than open air, believing narrow alleys, basements, and windowless rooms were deadlier, and urban mortality patterns confirm that poor ventilation significantly worsened outcomes. There were beliefs that bathing was dangerous during plague time, because open pores allowed sickness to enter, which sounds absurd until one considers that communal bathhouses were crowded, humid environments perfect for flea transfer and close contact. Medieval physicians warned against excessive physical exertion, claiming it weakened the heart and invited death, and modern understanding of immune stress and dehydration supports this cautious advice. People believed alcohol could protect against plague, not magically, but by strengthening the blood. And while alcohol offered no cure, safer drinking practices may have reduced reliance on contaminated water in some regions. There were chilling stories that once the plague entered a house, it marked the door invisibly, returning even after cleaning. And studies of repeated household outbreaks show that infestations of fleas and contaminated materials could cause reinfection weeks or months later. People believed that money itself was cursed, that coins passed through too many hands brought death. And while silver and copper were not lethal, constant exchange did move fleas and bacteria between homes and markets. Some whispered that children could carry the plague without appearing sick, an observation that aligns with modern understanding of asymptomatic or mild carriers who still contribute to spread. There were rumours that grief weakened survivors, that widows and widowers died soon after loved ones, and modern research confirms that bereavement and psychological stress increase mortality risk, even in non-pandemic conditions. Medieval people also believed that the plague rewrote fate, that marriages, inheritances, and social rank became meaningless overnight. And historical documents show massive redistribution of wealth, sudden rises of previously insignificant families, and the collapse of old dynasties. There were claims that laws lost power during outbreaks, that no punishment could deter theft or violence, and court records reveal sharp declines in prosecutions as institutions simply stopped functioning. People said that animals sensed the plague before humans did, fleeing towns or behaving strangely. And while folklore exaggerated this, animals are often sensitive to environmental and biological changes humans cannot detect. Some believed that the plague favoured crossroads, ports, and market towns, and mapping of outbreaks shows these nodes of movement were consistently hardest hit. Rumours warned that once fear entered a city, it spread faster than disease itself, changing behaviour in ways that made things worse. And this insight mirrors modern models, showing that panic can undermine public health responses. People claimed that silence was safer than noise, distance safer than bravery, and solitude safer than community. Grim conclusions born from observation rather than cowardice. There were beliefs that those who accepted the plague calmly died more peacefully, while those who resisted suffered more, which may reflect differences in stress response rather than fate. Chroniclers wrote that time itself felt distorted, that days blurred and weeks vanished during outbreaks, an experience echoed by survivors of modern pandemics who describe similar psychological effects. Perhaps the most haunting rumour was that the plague never truly left, that it only slept, waiting for the right moment to return. This belief haunted Europe for centuries, and history proved it right as outbreaks continued into the 18th century and beyond, even after science named the bacterium and identified its vectors. Plague did not vanish entirely. It retreated into animal reservoirs, exactly as medieval people feared. In the end, these rumours form a shadow record of human understanding, a parallel science written in terror instead of equations. They show that medieval society, stripped of microscopes and laboratories, still recognized patterns of contagion, risk, immunity, and survival through relentless observation. What sounds today like paranoia was often pattern recognition sharpened by catastrophe. The plague taught people brutally and repeatedly that invisible forces could shape civilization, that everyday objects could kill, that love and duty carried mortal risk, and that survival depended not only on faith or courage, but on distance, cleanliness, timing, and luck. The most unsettling truth is that if stripped of modern language, many of our own pandemic warnings would sound just as irrational to future generations, reminding us that fear, rumour, and truth are often woven together long before science finds the words to separate them. As later generations tried to make sense of why some people survived, while others vanished almost instantly, More rumours took shape that sounded fatalistic, but were grounded in careful watching. People believed that the plague chose its victims unevenly, sparing one house while destroying the next. And modern epidemiology confirms that micro differences in flea presence, immunity, timing of exposure, and simple chance could produce exactly this uneven devastation. There were claims that once someone felt the first deep chill in their bones, death was almost inevitable, and clinical descriptions of plague show that sudden chills often marked the onset of overwhelming infection. People whispered that sweating during fever was a bad sign, that it meant the body was losing the fight, and while sweating itself was not lethal, severe dehydration and electrolyte imbalance dramatically worsened survival chances. Some said that the plague fed on exhaustion, that those who worked themselves to collapse during outbreaks died faster. And physiological stress is now known to impair immune response during acute infection. There were stories that entire streets could be spared, simply because wind flowed differently through them. An idea that sounded mystical, but aligns with modern understanding of ventilation and airflow, reducing respiratory spread. People believed sunlight weakened the plague, that bright open spaces felt safer, and ultraviolet light does indeed reduce bacterial survival, while outdoor environments dilute infectious particles. Medieval rumours warned against sleeping on the ground, claiming sickness rose from the earth at night. And while the reasoning was flawed, fleas living in floor bedding and straw made low sleeping positions riskier. Some claimed that new clothes were safer than old ones, and while luxury played no role, freshly made garments were less likely to harbour fleas and bacteria than reused fabrics from infected homes. People believed the plague punished crowding more than poverty alone, observing that wealthy districts packed with servants and guests suffered heavily, while poor but sparse areas sometimes fared better. They said that inns and taverns were death traps, which records confirm, as constant turnover of travellers created perfect conditions for spread. There were rumours that touching your face too often invited illness, a habit blamed on nervousness, and while medieval people lacked germ theory, hand-to-face contact is now known to increase infection risk. Some believe that wounds and cuts made people more vulnerable, and septicemic plague could indeed enter through breaks in the skin. Stories circulated that once a city reached a certain number of deaths, escape became useless, as if the plague thickened with time, and while not literally true, exponential spread meant delayed responses were far less effective. People claimed that early flight saved lives, but late flight killed more. A grim observation confirmed by mortality data showing higher survival among those who left before widespread transmission.